But first, something very far away from a week of football sleaze and budget spin. You may have noticed Virginia Haussegger has returned to the news desk after a few weeks away. She wasn't on holidays. Actually, she took herself off to Afghanistan. After writing about women and the Taliban, she decided to see firsthand the plight of people in war-torn Kabul. She intended to tell the tale of an orphanage providing hope, but she also ended up being part of a Canberra filmmaker's story. Melissa Polomini reports.
Over a year ago, I was emceeing an International Women's Day event, and the speaker was Maboba Rawi. Now, I'd never heard of her before, never met her before. And I do a lot of these things, and I've got to say, I have never been as moved by a speaker as I was by Maboba. I was enchanted by her and entranced by her. The story she told of the work she's been doing, she's raised over $2.5 million for her work, a charity that's based in Sydney, and the work is for women and widows and orphans in Afghanistan. And she's built a number of orphanages, a couple of schools, and runs a number of programs for widows and a couple of medical clinics. But as she was describing why she does what she does, I found I was very, very moved. And Maboba is an incredibly persuasive woman. There's something about her that just kind of clicked with me. And after her speech and after the event was over, and I'd barely spoken to her other than to thank her and what have you, but she came up to me and she looked me in the eye and she said, she didn't know me, and she's not from Canberra, and she said, "I'm going to Afghanistan again next year in 2009. I want you to come." And I said, "I think I will." Now, I never do that. I get asked to do all sorts of things by all sorts of people all the time, and I always say no. And I left the event, and as I got into my car, and I thought that was a very weird thing for me to say, that I'd go. And you know what? I knew I would. I've always been passionately interested in the issue of Islam and gender and the treatment of women. And as we know, we've seen some of the worst treatment of women in the world by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And being a columnist, I've written about that quite a number of times, and I've also spoken about it publicly a number of times. And as a result of that, I've had quite a bit of feedback from locals and from Afghan people, and become embroiled in a bit of controversy at times, and it sort of started to eat away at me that I can't go on writing about this issue, and particularly writing commentary about this issue, when I have never experienced at all any of these places that I'm writing about. I didn't have any security. You know, I walked into Afghanistan, I had nothing but one of my newsreader jackets, actually, because Maboba told me to wear dark colours, preferably black, and so I had my black jacket on. And I actually got a bit of a giggle when I arrived at the airport, and it's just so overwhelming, and there was just so much chaos. And immediately you can see a lot of weaponry around, a lot of security, and you can see who's got security. And I thought, isn't this funny? I don't even have a bulletproof vest. I don't have a hard hat or a chemical warfare outfit, but I've got my newsreader jacket. What a load of... as if that's going to do anything for me. But, that was it. That's the way I chose to go. The first night, I've never been as frightened in my life, and I decided that the whole thing had been a terrible mistake, and that I had been kidding myself, and the idea of just packing my bag and flying into a war zone on my own was a very stupid thing to do, and that everything everyone had said to me was right. I was mad. And that I would leave, that I would ring the embassy first thing in the morning as soon as it got light and say, "Would you please come and help evacuate me?" What I did was I did the practical thing. I went through my mind, okay, what is bothering me here? What am I afraid of? What's the worst thing that can happen? I wrote my pros and cons. There were lots of cons. But I decided that I wasn't in an emotional state that was really fit to be making a decision about leaving. I had paid a lot of money to go there. I funded myself. It was a big deal for me to do. I had taken the time off work. I'd made so many arrangements such that I could be there, that to leave after less than a day, even though I was really, really, really frightened, I just thought that's not good enough.
So why is she here?
She's got 7 children and she haven't got a husband, and she have no food and nothing to feed the children.
The story that the filmmakers were following was perhaps for me the most profound. It was a very complex story for me to observe because it involved marriage of young girls and the sale of young girls for marriage to older men. And this was something that Maboba and I sort of clashed over.
The film I'm working now on is pretty much following Mahbouba Rabi, an Afghan-Australian woman, as you remember, that as she goes back to save one of the girls whose father has taken away from the orphanage to marry off to an older man, and ask her for her hand of marriage to marry one of the boys at the orphanage. So basically by marrying her to one of the boys at the orphanage, who's a teacher now, stopping her father from selling her off. Using this love story, basically, I wanted to show their desires, their sort of very sweet relationship that this 16-year-old had with the 18-year-old. I wanted to show that even though there's a lot of pain and suffering in Afghanistan, people still manage to be happy whenever they get a chance.
Amin Pelangi's film is going to be very interesting because that cultural clash kept coming up. And because I was so involved with Maboba and the orphanage and the story of the wedding and securing a safe future for this young girl, I went along with it, but every now and then would find myself pulling back.
Having her and seeing her transformation also added another angle. The fact that, here was an Australian woman who has all these feminist beliefs, I guess, came there to understand how it works, and seeing her through this time and seeing her changing through this time and understanding how it actually works. It's not about accepting it, maybe more tolerating how it works there, added a lot to the film.
Ascot Garage School built that library for them. And we locked them and they come back.
Meeting these women, and particularly young girls, when you can see in them, they have such passion. There's a real fire in them. They're very lively, they're very active, they're very funny. Every night at the orphanage we'd end up dancing and singing. There's a lot of life in these people. They have been through an incredibly tough time. Every young person I met, anyone younger than me that I met, had never known peace. They'd only ever lived through wartime and conflict. Afghanistan has been in conflict now for the last 3 decades, so anyone 30 or younger only knows war. One of the places that we were visiting whilst I was in Afghanistan, in Kabul, in the city, in the centre of Kabul, is a small orphanage run by Uncle Haji. He's Maboba's uncle. That was the very first orphanage she set up. Now, all the children are sponsored by Australians. You can sponsor a child for, I think it's $35 a month, or sponsor a widow for $50 a month. We went to the orphanage because, well, to see it anyway, but Maboba had told me that despite the sponsorship, there are 34 kids there, despite the sponsorship, the place was really run down and they can't keep it operating anymore. And part of her trip was to let Uncle Haji know that this orphanage has to be closed. We went there and the kids had prepared a concert for us, and they were dressed up in their best Afghani clothes and all their costumes. They're all bright and they look fantastic. And we went and had lunch, and I've taken some photos of the lunch where the light coming into the main room where the children eat and they also sleep, and in fact basically live in this big rectangular room. The light coming in at lunchtime was really quite dramatic, and there was this moment where I could see Maboba and Uncle Haji sitting together, talking intently together, and I could see the intensity on both their faces, and I thought, oh, she really is telling him, she's explaining that she has to close the orphanage because there isn't enough to keep it running. And as soon as we got in the car, Maboba was being very quiet. She's normally very chatty, and I said to her, you did tell him, didn't you? She just looks out the window, and I said, Maboba, you told him. You did tell him, didn't you? She just turns around and she looks at me and she says, you saw those children. You saw those children. As if I can close that orphanage. And it was just one of those moments you think, sorry, but they are orphans. They have no family. They were amazing, amazing children. They were really happy, educated, smart kids who were proud, and they all had aspirations to do things with their life. How could she close that place and, you know, to say, basically lock the door and say, we can't fund this anymore, we can't fund the $25,000 a year, we're just going to have to close it. And, you know, when she looked at me, she said, well, what would I do with those children? You know, what? I agreed with her. So you come away and you think, well, I don't know how she's going to do it, but I you know, she'll do something. She'll do something to find the money. I know she will. So many people have said to me when I've come home, oh, it must have been so sad. The orphanage must be really sad. It's not. The place, Afghanistan, Kabul, is a mess. It is dreadful. The conditions people live in and the homes I went into is just appalling. You know, they have nothing. But the orphanage is a really happy place. Not only is it clean and bright and breezy, the kids are really happy kids. They're funny kids. And every night we ended up singing and dancing. They love dancing. And I've got to say, you know, there were nights that I was there at midnight saying, you know what, I'm a bit tired now. I need to go to sleep. I've learnt so much. A lot to do with understanding a culture and understanding religious motivation. I will never judge as quickly as I have in the past, I think. Perhaps that's the most valuable lesson.
And those photos were Virginia's, and the footage came from Amin Palangi's upcoming film, from the ABC's Australian Story, and from Marion Leigh, who generously gave us her home videos from a recent trip. The editor was Jan Pritchard, and we've already posted a link to Maboba's promise on the Stateline website.